Those whispering guns, oh Christ, I want to go out and screech at them to stop. I'm going crazy. I'm going staring mad because of the guns. These are the words of poet Siegfried Sassoon, writing about a trauma so profound it would reshape our understanding of the human mind forever. This is the story of shell shock, a condition that emerged from the mud-soaked trenches of World War I, where men's minds shattered like glass under the relentless hammer of industrialized warfare. August 1914. Across Europe, a generation of young men marched toward what they believed would be a brief, glorious adventure. The British War Office promised the conflict would be over by Christmas. 2.5 million British men volunteered, eager to prove themselves as Victorian gentlemen, to uphold the ideals of honor, duty, and empire. They had no idea they were walking into hell. The Western Front stretched 440 miles from the North Sea to the Swiss border, a scar across the face of Europe where millions of men would face a type of warfare humanity had never before experienced. This was industrial killing on an unprecedented scale. In the trenches, men lived like rats. They shared their cramped, waterlogged dugouts with corpses, lice, and the constant stench of death. Above ground, no man's land stretched like a lunar landscape, a poisoned wasteland of barbed wire, shell craters, and rotting flesh. But it was the guns that drove them mad. The artillery barrages were relentless. Shells screamed overhead for hours, sometimes days, without pause. The earth shook. Men's teeth rattled in their skulls. The very air seemed to vibrate with death. And then, when the bombardment stopped, they knew what came next. The whistle, the charge, the machine guns waiting in the dark. This was the Somme, Passchendaele, Verdun, names that would become synonymous with slaughter. In a single day at the Somme, 60,000 British soldiers fell. The human mind, evolved for survival in small tribal conflicts, was never meant to endure this mechanical harvest of death, and so it began to break. Dr. Charles Samuel Myers was working at a casualty clearing station when he first encountered something that defied medical understanding. In 1915, he treated 3 soldiers with identical, inexplicable symptoms. They could not speak. They trembled uncontrollably. One had been buried alive for 18 hours after an artillery strike. Myers published his findings in The Lancet, coining a term that would echo through history: shell shock. At first, the symptoms seemed to make sense. Surely, Myers reasoned, the concussive force of nearby explosions had damaged the delicate tissues of the brain and spine. These men were physically wounded, just as surely as if they had been shot. They deserved discharge, medical care, and war pensions. But then something disturbing happened. Soldiers who had never been near exploding shells began arriving with identical symptoms. They stared into nothing, their eyes wide with terror at sights only they could see. They could not hold a cup of tea without spilling it. Some could not speak at all, their voices simply gone. Others spoke in whispers or stammered helplessly, or screamed in their sleep about gas attacks that happened months before. Patient J. Milner of the 14th Reserve Battalion of the Royal Field Artillery provides a typical case. On June 1, 1916, Milner felt the force of an artillery strike that sent him flying into the wheel of a nearby howitzer. He was left deaf and semi-conscious. When he tried to call out to his comrades to seek shelter, he found that he could not speak. During his return to Great Britain, Milner developed tremors that grew gradually worse. Soon he was bedridden. His legs wasted away until he could no longer stand. By July 23, 1916, he was invalided from the war, a broken man at barely 20 years old. But Milner was one of the lucky ones, he was believed. Many others were not. The British military establishment faced a crisis. If shell shock was a real injury, then 80,000 diagnosed cases represented a staggering toll. And these were only the men who had been officially recognized. The true number was certainly far higher. But there was another, more troubling possibility. What if these men were simply cowards, lack of moral fiber, cowardice in the face of the enemy, malingering to avoid duty? The Victorian ideal of masculinity demanded that men be stoic, brave, and in control of their emotions, even in the face of mechanized death. Those who broke under the strain were seen as failures, as emasculated weaklings who had betrayed their comrades and their cause. Shell shock became associated with youth and weakness. Newspaper articles referred to patients as scared young boys ill, prepared for the horrors of war. The implication was clear: a real man would endure. Dr. Louis Yelland represented the disciplinary approach to treatment. He claimed a near 80% success rate with his patients, success being defined as soldiers returning to the front lines. His method was simple: he would employ electric shock therapy, applying electrical current to the affected body parts until the symptoms disappeared. For soldiers who could not speak, Yelland applied shocks to the throat. The electrical torture would continue until the men screamed out, proving their mutism cured. He exploited their fears as treatment, placing those who feared loud noises in rooms overlooking busy main roads, or putting those who feared isolation in solitary confinement. Yelland's view was that these men had experienced a complete loss of manhood and needed to remember the bravado that would carry them through the rest of the war. The treatment was not healing. It was punishment disguised as medicine. Some men, unable to bear the shame and unable to return to the trenches, simply disappeared. Others faced military tribunals. A few were executed for cowardice, the ultimate price for a mind that could no longer pretend to be whole. But not all doctors shared Yelland's brutal approach. Dr. William Halse Rivers, yes, he actually had Rivers twice in his name, had trained at Cambridge, and believed in a radically different method: compassion. Rivers had studied under Charles Myers and shared his mentor's growing conviction that shell shock was a genuine psychological injury. Craiglockhart Hospital in Scotland, Rivers began treating patients with what he called cathartic therapy. Instead of electric shocks, Rivers offered conversation. Instead of punishment, he provided understanding. He encouraged his patients to discuss their trauma, to confront the memories that haunted them. This flew in the face of the military's stiff upper lip mentality, but Rivers believed that only by remembering and understanding could these men begin to heal. One of Rivers' most famous patients was the poet Siegfried Sassoon, the same man whose words opened our story. Sassoon had been sent to Craiglockhart not for cowardice, but for publicly protesting the war's continuation. His poetry gave voice to the voiceless, describing the psychological wounds that official medicine was only beginning to recognize. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulcet decorum est a pro patria mori. Rivers' approach represented a revolutionary shift in thinking. The environment, not the man's moral character, was the cause of shell shock. These soldiers were not cowards or malingerers. They were human beings pushed beyond the breaking point by inhuman conditions. But even Rivers faced a terrible contradiction. His goal was to heal these men so they could return to military service, back to the very environment that had shattered them in the first place. It was a moral paradox that haunted him throughout the war. November 11, 1918, the guns finally fell silent. The Great War was over. But for the men who had survived it, the battle was just beginning. 20,000 British soldiers were still suffering from shell shock at war's end. The true number of affected men was certainly much higher. Many had never received a diagnosis, stigmatized into silence by a society that saw their invisible wounds as weakness. Civilian asylums, hospitals, and even spas were converted to accommodate the ever-growing number of shell shock patients. These men, some of them heroes with medals for bravery, shuffled through the halls like ghosts, their minds still trapped in the trenches they had left behind. The military establishment had learned its lesson, but perhaps not the right one. In 1917, British command had banned the use of the term shell shock, preferring war neurosis, to emphasize that it was not the impact of shells, but the war as a whole that caused the injury. It was a small step toward understanding, but the stigma remained. When World War II arrived, the condition was called battle fatigue or combat exhaustion, different names for the same ancient wound that warfare inflicts on the human soul. Today we call it post-traumatic stress disorder. The clinical language has evolved, but the fundamental truth remains unchanged. The human mind has limits and war will always find them. The muddy, blood-soaked trenches of World War I gave birth to modern psychology's understanding of trauma. The men who trembled in no man's land, who could not speak of the horrors they had witnessed, who woke screaming in the night. They were not weak. They were human. Shell shock forced a reckoning with the fragility of the human psyche. It challenged Victorian notions of masculinity and stoicism. It revealed the terrible cost of asking young men to endure the unendurable, and punishing them when they could not. The 80,000 British soldiers diagnosed with shell shock were among the first casualties of modern warfare's assault on the human mind. Their suffering paved the way for today's understanding of trauma, even if they were never truly heard in their own time. Dr. Rivers once wrote that his duty was to heal his patients so they could return to war. Today, we might ask a different question. What if our duty is to heal our society so that such wars become impossible? The men who suffered from shell shock have long since passed away, but their voices still whisper to us across the decades, carrying a warning as relevant today as it was in 1914. The human cost of war extends far beyond the battlefield, and the wounds of the mind can be as devastating as any physical injury. Shell shock remains a grim reminder of what we demand of those who serve, and what we owe them when they return. In understanding their suffering, we come face to face with our own humanity and the terrible price of our civilization's failures. The guns have stopped whispering, but we must never stop listening.